They kidnapped my kids, man. They actually had the nerve to take my children right out of my own life, thinking they were some kind of untouchable gods of the suburb because I supposedly broke a rule in their little handbook. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't in oppos, possibly have grasped in their tiny, power-hungry minds, was that I'm not just a guy who likes his lawn mowed. I'm a federal judge. And they just committed the single biggest legal suicide in the history of local government. Honestly, if you'd asked me a year ago if a group of retirees in matching polo shirts would ever try to play bounty hunter with my family, I would have laughed in your face. But here we are, and looking back at the wreckage I left of their lives, I don an oppos. Regret a single second of the fire I rained down on them. It started on a Tuesday, one of those crisp October mornings in Silver Creek where the air smells like wood smoke and expensive mulch, and I was sitting at my kitchen island with a lukewarm mug of black coffee, trying to make sense of a complex racketeering brief for the circuit court, while my 10-year-old son, Leo, and my 7-year-old daughter, Maya, were arguing over who got the last of the cereal. We'd moved into this place about 8 months prior, a gorgeous mid-century modern tucked away on the edge of the woods, and I'd been meticulous during the closing process because I'd heard the horror stories about the Silver Creek Homeowners Association. So I had my surveyor and my personal attorney, Marcus, double and triple check the plot lines to confirm that while we shared a road with the community, our house was technically in quote, island in quote, property, completely exempt from their jurisdiction and their ridiculous bylaws. I remember hearing the mail slot clink, and Leo ran to grab it, tossing a bright neon orange envelope onto the counter that looked more like a hazardous waste warning than a letter, and when I opened it, my blood didn't in oppos. Just boil. It went cold because it wasn't in oppos. A fine for trash can left out too long. It was in quote, notice of forced vacation of illegal occupants in quote, stating that since our neighborhood was strictly a 55-plus retirement sanctuary, my children were considered in quote, unauthorized residents in quote, and had to be removed from the premises within 48 hours or the board would take in quote, custodial measures in quote, to ensure the integrity of the community. I nearly choked on my coffee, thinking it was a prank, so I called Marcus and he just sighed, telling me he'd already sent them 3 formal letters explaining the boundary maps, but that the board president, a woman named Beatrice Vance who acted like she was the Queen of England but with less charm and more Botox, refused to acknowledge anything she didn't and oppos. Print herself. I figured it was just more posturing, the kind of hobbyist tyranny you see from people who have too much time and not enough purpose. So I kissed the kids goodbye, sent them off to the bus stop, and headed to the courthouse, figuring I'd deal with Beatrice's delusions of grandeur later that evening with a very stern, very official-looking legal threat. But when I pulled back into my driveway at 5:30 p.m., the world just stopped because the front door was slightly ajar, the house was silent, and the smell of the dinner I'd prepped in the slow cooker was the only thing greeting me instead of the usual chaos of kids and cartoons. I sprinted through the rooms, screaming their names, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I found Maya's favorite stuffed rabbit lying face down in the hallway, which she never, ever leaves behind, and then I saw it. Another orange flyer taped to the inside of my glass door, right at eye level, saying, in quote, per the emergency bylaws regarding illegal youth occupation, the minors have been placed in secure temporary housing pending their transfer to state services or out of area kin. Please contact the board for further instruction. End quote. I didn't oppos. Breathe. I couldn't in oppos. I just felt this white-hot surge of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated rage that started in my toes and ended in my clenched fists because these people had an end oppos. Just overstepped a property line. They had walked into my home and stolen my heart, thinking they're in quote, rules in quote, gave them the right to play God with my family. I didn't in oppos. Called the HOA first, I called the state police, and within 10 minutes my quiet cul-de-sac was lit up like a Christmas tree with blue and red lights. And when the lead investigator, a grizzled guy named Miller, read that orange flyer, his jaw literally dropped, and he looked at me and said, in quote, Judge, tell me I ain't oppos. I'm misinterpreting this because it looks like a bunch of senior citizens just committed a felony kidnapping in broad daylight, end quote. And I just looked him in the eye and said, end quote, Miller, they didn't in oppos. Just kidnapped my kids. They just signed a confession, end quote. We didn't oppose. T waste time with a phone call. We drove straight to Beatrice's house, which was this sprawling, sterile-looking mansion at the center of the development. And when she opened the door, she was wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of Chardonnay, looking at us with this infuriatingly smug expression as if we were the ones trespassing on her time. End quote. Judge Holloway, end quote. She said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern that makes your skin crawl, end quote. I assume you and oppose. Rehear about the relocation of your guests. We really try to give you a chance to do this quietly, but rules are rules, and we have to protect the peace of our silver members, you understand. End quote. I took a step toward her, and for the first time in my career, I didn't oppose. T feel like a man of the cloth or a man of the law. I felt like a father who was ready to tear down the world. I told her, end quote, Beatrice, you have exactly 10 seconds to tell me where my children are before I have the state police tear this house apart brick by brick, and then I'm going to personally oversee the trial that puts you in a cage for the rest of your natural life, end quote. Her smile faltered just a tiny bit, but she had this insane, cult-like devotion to her position, and she actually leaned back and said, end quote, Udon and Oppos. TB dramatic, David. They're at the, and Oppos, Serenity Youth Annex and Oppos. It's a private boarding facility the board uses for these types of situations. They're perfectly safe, though I must say, your attitude is exactly why we don and Oppos. T want young families in Silver Creek, end quote. Miller didn't and oppose. T even wait for me to respond. He pushed past her, cuffed her right there in her foyer, and, as she started screaming about, end quote, harassment, end quote, and end quote, board immunity, end quote, we got the address of the, end quote, annex, end quote, which turned out to be a rundown, unlicensed daycare run by the treasure sister about 30 miles out in the country. The drive, there was the longest 30 minutes of my life, my mind racing through every horrific scenario. But when we finally burst through those doors, I saw Leo and Maya sitting on a stained rug, looking terrified and confused. And when they saw me, they didn't oppose. T even scream. They just collapsed into me, sobbing, and I felt this weight lift off my chest that was so heavy, I thought I might actually pass out from the relief. But once the kids were safe at my sister's house, the end quote, judge end quote, and me took over, and let me tell you, when a federal judge decides to go to war, it's not a battle, it's an execution, because the next morning I didn't oppose. T just file a police report, I mobilized the heavy artillery. I called Marcus and told him I wanted every single board member's personal financial history, every HOA bank statement for the last decade, and a federal injunction to freeze the association's assets immediately. And while the board was busy scrambling to hire a lawyer to fight the kidnapping charges, I was busy discovering that Beatrice and her inner circle had an oppose. T just been bullying neighbors. They've been treating the HOA fund like a personal piggy bank. We found hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into, end quote, consulting fees, end quote, that went straight to a shell company owned by Beatrice's son, fake landscaping contracts that paid for the treasurer's Florida vacation home, and a systematic scheme of predatory fining where they would target elderly residents who had no heirs, wait for the fines to pile up, and then, end quote, legally, end quote, seize their homes to flip them for a profit. The look on Beatrice's face when she showed up to her preliminary hearing, not in her silk robe, but in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that matched her flyers, was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen, especially when I walked into the courtroom. Not as the presiding judge, of course, but as the primary witness and the man who had personally handed the FBI the roadmap to her racketeering empire. She tried to argue that she was, end quote, protecting the community, end quote, that her actions were, end quote, voted on by the board, end quote, and that my property was subject to her rules because of an, end quote, implied covenant, end quote. But I just sat there and watched as the prosecution played the recording of her smugly telling me my kids were in a, end quote, safe location, end quote, and the silence in that room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. I didn't oppose. T stop at the criminal charges, though. I wanted them to feel the same hopelessness they tried to inflict on me, so I helped every single resident they'd ever defrauded file a class action lawsuit that hit them where it actually hurt, their wallets. And because the HOA assets were frozen and the insurance didn't oppose, T cover, end quote, intentional criminal acts of kidnapping, end quote, the board members were personally liable for the damages. one by one, their own homes, the very houses they used as a base for their petty little empire, went up for auction to pay the settlements. And I made sure to buy the clubhouse myself through a holding company, only to have it demolished and replaced with a sprawling, colorful playground that we dedicated to the children of the county, specifically the ones the Silver Creek Board thought were unauthorized. Within 6 months, the Silver Creek HOA didn't oppose. Just stop existing. It became a cautionary tale taught in law schools across the state about the dangers of unchecked quasi-governmental power, and Beatrice ended up taking a plea deal for 10 years in a federal facility, where, ironically, there are very strict rules about when you can use the common room and how high you can keep your voice. My kids are doing great now, though Leo still asks if we're allowed to have a trampoline in the backyard, and I always tell him the same thing. Son, as long as you aren't an oppos. Hurting anyone, no one has the right to tell you how to live in your own home, especially not someone who thinks a title on a neighborhood board makes them a king. But the thing that really gets me, the part that still keeps me up sometimes, is how many people just let them do it. How many neighbors watch my kids get put into that SUV and just turn their heads because they didn't oppos. Want to get a fine, or because they like the exclusivity of the rules. It makes me wonder if the real problem ISN and oppos, just the Karens of the world, but the people who stay quiet while they're in charge. I've had people reach out to me from all over, saying I was too harsh or that I used my judicial influence to bully a group of seniors, and I just tell them that if you think protecting your children from being stolen by a group of embezzlers is bullying then you and I have a very different definition of justice. So I'm curious, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have played it by the book and waited for the slow wheels of the civil court to turn? Or would you have burned the whole system down like I did? Is there ever a point wherein, community rules cross the line into something much more dangerous? Or am I the one who went too far because I had the power to make it hurt? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because I've seen the law from both sides of the bench now, and I'm starting to think that sometimes the only way to get real justice is to be the one holding the match. If you enjoyed seeing a neighborhood tyrant get exactly what was coming to her, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story, because you never know which of your neighbors might be planning their next emergency bylaw.